Yay.
So there we go. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Cooper Brown, and I am one half of Stories with Spirit with Rachel Ann Harding. And the first thing I'm going to do here is mute everyone. And then I'm going to stop you from being able to unmute yourselves, as there is that moment where in the middle of a story, someone by accident unmutes themselves and their dog starts barking, or they drop a glass or something, and we've all been in that Zoom moment. So we're gonna stop that. But at the end of each story, you will see a little pop-up on your screen that says the host is asking you to unmute. And if you would like to unmute in between stories to give us your applause, we would so graciously appreciate that. For those of you that haven't played before, if you would like to have your cameras on, we would love to be able to see your faces. One of the reasons we do Zoom meetings, as opposed to webinars or live cast to YouTube, is so that we can see people's faces and that we can have this chit chat before shows and we can talk after the show. And it's the closest that we've found to feeling like we're actually in a room with folks in this strange world, though as we begin to open up, we'll see if people want to keep coming back to this world that we've created. So again, I have a couple of little announcements. If you are new to Zoom or haven't been on Zoom for a little while, at the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's a little button that says View. And if you click on that button, you have a couple of options, and my computer is being a little weird, which is why I'm stalling. So the option that you are probably in right now is speaker view, which is to say you are just seeing me on the screen. You will see the person that I have spotlit. You also have the option to click on gallery view, which will give you the Brady Bunch, the Hollywood Squares, the Muppet Show look, depending on your cultural reference. You're welcome to watch the show in either, but that is how you switch back and forth between your views. At the bottom of your screen, on the bottom left, you should have a button that says mute and a button that says stop video. So if you click on that stop video, it will turn your video on if your video is off, or off if your video is on, and the mute button is how you unmute yourself. On the bottom of your screen as well, there should be a button that says chat. That will open the chat window on the side of your screen, so you don't see chat pop-ups over the top of the screen. And one of the things we do ask is that when we are performing, we ask that people do not chat during the performance, because especially if you're on an iPad or a phone, the chat always pops up on top of the screen. And there are definitely people that find it a little distracting. So other things here. For everybody that shared the show, thank you so much. Thank you for putting the word out. Thank you for helping us bring people in. This show today is sort of PG. So if you have little children, that's about where we're at today. And then lastly, we get a couple of questions on this every time. These shows are what we call pay what it's worth. So when you bought a ticket, you didn't pay anything unless you were one of the 2 people that paid me beforehand. At the end of the show at 1:30 Mountain Daylight Time, you will receive an email with all of the links via PayPal or Zelle or Venmo, or if a check is easiest, the address to send a check. And so at the end of the show, we ask you to ask yourself, how much was an hour and 15 minutes of art worth to you? And if you are able to show us that, we would be happy to receive it. So all of that said, I'm gonna get out of the way now. Let me introduce my storytelling partner, Rachel Ann Harding, in Colorado here with me. We have been doing this now for 8 years. It's been a lovely, strange ride. We've always done a winter solstice show. Our first show was a winter solstice show, but last year was the only time we've been able to do a summer solstice show. And so this year we have continued the tradition, which is part of the reason this is at noon, but also so that we could have our friends from Europe join us. So I'm gonna get out of the way and I'm gonna let Anne take us to Fairyland.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on a day wherever you are. It looks like it's hot in many, many places. So I hope you're in a cool position with a nice cup of something lovely in your hand, and let's go somewhere interesting. It wasn't a party unless Kitty baked the cake. Whether it was a birthday or a christening or a holiday, Everyone knew that it was only a party if Kitty supplied the cake. She could bake Dundee cakes to Clootie, buns to bread, everything she baked. Oh, it was delicious. And people made up holidays just so they could have one of her cakes soon. They said she was the best baker in 7 counties, and the only reason she wasn't the best baker in the world, well, her cakes never made it that far. But the only people who were annoyed about Kitty's cakes were the other crowd. You know, the fairies. They're like that neighbor you have that makes some noise, but you really don't want to know what they're doing. The fairies are at every party, and they steal food quite often. But they never got a taste of Kitty's cakes. They never even got a crumb. For the last crumb would be eaten before they could make it to the tables, and all that was left was the smell of her cake in the air. And the less cake they got, the angrier they became. Now it was solstice, the summer solstice. Kitty was just coming home, and it was getting late. It was still twilight around her as she made her way home, and she was eager to get home to Jack and her baby. And maybe that was why she took the shortcut near the fairy hill. Those green hills rolling out and around her, the fireflies dancing. But were they fireflies? As they came closer, she realized they were fairies, but before she could reach for in her pocket to see if she had any iron, they blew fern dust in her eyes and she fell asleep. When she woke, she was in the fairy hill, a soaring crystal cavern, and the fairies danced around her. Some had wings, some had tails, but the king of the fairies had both wings and tail. Now he was small enough he could fit in her hand, but he was king enough that she stood and she dropped a curtsy. The king addressed her, "Madam, we have never had a taste of your cakes, and yet we have been tortured by the smell of them. And now we have stolen you away, and you will be our baker and bake us cakes whenever we want." Now, if Kitty was afraid, she didn't show it. She nodded seriously. "Your Majesty, it is a travesty on par with the destruction of a fairy tree that you have never had a cake of mine. I will make you a cake tonight. I'll make you a Dundee cake. Yes, I would be more than happy to bake you one. Will you bring me to your kitchen?" Fairies were very excited, but they were also a little confused. Their kitchen, well, okay, they could bring her some things. They brought her out their biggest bowls and their finest ingredients, but their biggest bowls were small enough to be a child's teacup. Their ingredients were chamomile flowers, and she looked at all of their ingredients. "Your Majesty, I am an excellent baker, but I don't know how to use these ingredients. But if you go to my house, I can tell you what you'll need to get. You'll need to get 2 big bowls, a wooden spoon, flour, sugar. There's a jar of brown spices. There's some candied orange peel, 3 eggs, butter, my cooking whiskey. Don't drink it on the way home. That should be it. If you bring all of that to me, I should be able to make you a fine Dundee cake." The king nodded, and the fairies trooped out into the night. Now at their little cottage, Jack was feeding the baby. And the door opened, and he looked up expecting to see Kitty. Oh, it was late, and he was excited to see her home, but no, it was a line of fairies walking in and making themselves at home in her kitchen. Well, in Kitty's kitchen, they got Kitty's 2 big bowls. They gathered up a number of ingredients. They didn't even look or acknowledge Jack, and Jack just watched them, and then they walked out the door, the last one finally looking over Jack and nodding before they went out and into the night. Jack looked at the baby. "Wherever those ingredients for our cake is going, I guess Kitty's probably there too." When the fairies brought all the things into the cavern, Kitty looked at them. "Yes, you have brought everything. You are the most clever fairies." She took out one of those big bowls and she began to mix the wet ingredients together. The butter, the eggs, and as she put them all in the bowl, oh, she sighed. "What is it?" said the king of the fairies. "What is it? Have we forgotten something?" "Not really. Well, when I cook at home, my old cat curls up on my foot and purrs. And it calms me so much that I sing, and I'm able to mix these cakes just from memory. I don't think he'd chase you. He's such an old cat, he doesn't even chase flies anymore. And I worry that if I try baking without him, well, it just wouldn't be the same kind of cake. Now, fairies don't like cats, but they wanted cake more than they were afraid of the cat. So the king nodded and the fairies went out into the night. Jack was just burping the baby when the door opened and in came the line of fairies. He watched them walk over to the old cat who was sleeping, curled up in Kitty's chair. And the fairies looked at the cat, and then they began shoving each other towards the cat, so to see who was going to be brave enough to actually try to lift it. And when they realized that cat wasn't going to do anything, they crawled underneath and began to lift the cat. But cats are 80% water. So the higher they lifted, the more the cat just bowed around them. Jack felt sorry for those fairies, and he went and grabbed a basket and poured the cat into the basket and handed it to the fairies, who lifted it over their heads, and out they went, the last one nodding at Jack. Jack looked at the baby. Wherever that cat is going, I bet the cake is, and wherever that cake is, I bet there's Kitty. Cake and Kitty, they'll certainly have a story for you tonight, little one. Back at the fairy hill, in came the cat. The cat was poured out next to Kitty's foot. It curled up, and she started to mix the wet ingredients in that bowl and sing. She did begin to sing, and forgive me. Sing me a song of a lass that is gone. Say, could that lass be I? Merry of soul, she sailed on a day over the sea to sky. And then she set the other bowl down, and she began to put the dry ingredients in, the flour and the spices, the sugar. And as she began to mix it, she sighed. What is it? What is it? Said the king of the fairies. What did we forget? Oh, well, I usually cook with my dog next to my leg, and his tail thumps against the floor. And so I keep beat when I'm mixing all the dry ingredients together. And I could do it without him here, but I'm not sure it would be the same kind of cake. The fairies looked at each other and at the king of the fairies, and the king nodded, and off they went in the night. And there was Jack, changing the baby's nappy, when in came the fairies, walked over to the dog who was curled up by the fireplace. They began to poke the dog. They began to try to pull him out by his ear, and the dog would shake his head and curl up down to go to sleep. Until the fairies just looked at Jack. And Jack looked at the fairies. And then he went and got a rope, and he tied it to the dog's collar, and the fairies led the dog out and into the night. Well, into the fairy hill came the dog, who was more than happy to see his mistress, his tail wagging back and forth, fur flying everywhere, fairies getting knocked this way and that. But then the dog came and sat down next to Kitty's leg. Kitty began to mix as the dog thumped his tail. Sing me a song of a lass that is gone. Say, could that lass be I? Merry of soul, she sailed on a day over the sea to sky. Now she had the dry and the wet ingredients. She was ready to pour them together. She sighed. What is it now? Said the king. We are not bringing you your chickens. Oh, the chicken. I don't need the chickens. It's I'm a mother, and I think of my babe out there with Jack. I know he's a good father, but it would help me settle and concentrate on making this cake if I just knew they were well. The king didn't even need to nod. Off into the night the fairies went, and Jack, who had realized what was happening by now, had wrapped up the baby and was putting on his boots when the fairies came in. They just nodded this way, and Jack nodded, and off they went into the night. Jack following them to the fairy hill, the hill opening, down he went, and there was his wife, and there was the dog and the cat and all of her cooking ingredients. And she smiled. Oh, Jack, it's good to see you. How's the baby? Oh, sleeping? Oh, good. Oh, good. Just have a seat. I'll be done soon. And so she poured the wet ingredients into the dry with the cat on her foot, the dog next to her. There was her babe. She began to mix Sing me a song of a lass that is gone. Say, could that lass be I? Mary of soul, she sailed on a day over the sea to sky. And then she winked at Jack and began again as she stepped on the cat's tail. Sing me a song, and the cat began to growl. Of a lass that is gone, and the dog began to howl. Oh, say, could that lass be I? Mary of soul, and the baby began to cry. She sailed on a day over the sea to sky, and the whole cavern was filled with wailing and yowling and howling. And then she took her foot off the cat's tail. The cat calmed down. The dog stopped wailing. And Jack was able to rock the baby, and she picked up the bowl as the fairies were crouched on the floor with their hands over their ears. And she looked at the king and she said, now, where's your oven? It's time to bake. Oven? We have no oven. Oh, well, here's what we'll do then. I'll take the batter and the baby and the cat and the dog and my husband home. I will put the baby to bed, and I will bake you the cake tonight. And I'll put that cake out underneath the tree in my yard for you to enjoy. And I'll do more than that. I'll make you a cake every solstice, winter and summer, because you've shown me a great deal of kindness and hospitality here today. The king was almost near to tears, and he nodded. And so the fairy hill opened, and Kitty carried a bowl of batter, and Jack carried the baby and the basket with the cat in the other hand. And the fairies carried the ingredients, following them out into the starry night, a little bit of sugar glittering under the moonlight. And Kitty was as good as her word. She went home, she put the baby to bed, and she baked a very fine Dundee cake with those blanched almonds and white rose across the top. She put the cake outside, and the next morning, in its place, was a gold piece. And every solstice after that, Kitty made them a cake, because it wasn't a party unless Kitty baked the cake.
Brava! Brava!
Beautiful.
Wonderful.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. Fabulous.
Nice.
Oh,
Wonderful.
well done, well done. All right, I will mute all again. And find myself. There we are. All right, thank you, Anne. It's been a while since I've heard that one, and when Anne said that she wanted to tell it, it was, oh yes. This, much of this show has been driven by what Anne desired to tell, which is sometimes how these work. So this next story is one that, if you have been following our fairy tale variation shows, you may have heard some months ago. But when I first wrote it, it was with a setup that you get to see the fulfillment of today in the story that Anne will tell afterwards. And when Anne told me that she wanted to tell the story that she was going to tell, we decided that this was the obvious lead-in to that story. That morning, when we opened the doors to the stone barn and saw it stacked reel upon reel upon reel of the finest golden thread that anyone had ever seen, no one was more surprised than I was. Even the miller's daughter, there among all that wealth, looked surprised. It had been a bet. Her father is a drunk and a braggart and, of course, a miller. You know my daughter, she can spin straw into gold. I laughed. I laughed the laugh of a young king of a poor country who loved a miller's daughter. Now my kingdom, it is so small that when we met in secret, there was just a glimmer of hope when we whispered together that it might be possible for us to marry. But we both knew that for the sake of the kingdom, I must marry a rich dowry. But then her father made his boast. My good man, are you willing to wager on it? If I win, a year's exemption from your taxes, though your daughter keeps the gold if there is any. And if she loses, her life is mine. Now I heard the gasp run around the room, but I caught her eyes. Her life was mine, as mine was hers. And so that whole town watched that cold September night as we packed the stone barn filled with straw. We put her spinning wheel there before the fire, and we locked the doors. And the next morning, she had done it. Her father erupted in laughter. See, I told you she could. Ha ha! No taxes for a year. Come on, lads, drinks are on me. He and all the rest trooped off back to the inn for celebratory drinks, even as dawn finished breaking. And I stood there with her in that golden glow in the firelight and the thread. How? Oh, she laughed. Oh, my king, my love. I knew your game. My life would be yours. My life is yours. Just last night I was planning on lying down in all that straw and sleeping when he appeared. A dwarf, no higher than your waist, stepped from the shadows. He had a long white beard that brushed the ground, a brown jacket, and a red cap, and he offered me a bargain. My necklace in exchange to spin all that straw into gold. My eyes fell to her throat, and the necklace of silver and blue stones that I had given her in secret was missing. My love, my king, I know our country is poor, and while you have lost your wager, and I my necklace, a room full of gold, it is not a poor dowry. I watched him pull up the stool before my spinning wheel, and he snapped. The air grew sharp and brittle. There was a spark that ran down the length of his beard. And then he began to spin. Whir, whir, whir. Handful after handful of straw he fed into the wheel. It was not 3 turns before the reel was full of golden thread. Whir, whir, whir. It was but moments before there was not a single piece of straw left in the whole barn. If you have need again of such a task, knock 3 times upon the hearthstone, and I will come to you again. The air grew soft. He stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I was so stupid. I was arrogant and foolish. We thought it was such a simple plan. I would wager with her father twice more, that she could not do such a task again, that if she failed, the crown would take her head. But if she succeeded, she would be my queen. We thought we were so clever. That second night, she traded her mother's ring, and again the barn was filled with gold. I lost 5 years' taxes on her father's mill. And the third morning, we opened the doors of the barn, and it was stuffed, reel upon reel upon reel of golden thread. The crowd, they cheered for her. They lifted her onto their shoulders in triumph. She had done it! But she did not smile. It was only later, as we sat in our castle before our fire, that she told me the rest. That third night, when the dwarf appeared, he just shook his head when I offered him the jewel you gave me. What need I with such a bauble as that? The gold of the earth is mine, and its treasures as is the gold I spin. My necklace And my ring. To keep you playing, for there must be a bargain. And what would you take in bargain tonight? For you to keep your pretty head? For you to marry your king? To spin straw into gold? Daughter of Eve, I tell you this. I would take the first child born to you. Do we have a deal? He would take no other thing. And in the end, there was nothing to say but yes. It was in the warm sunshine of June that her belly just began to round. And soon it was apparent to all that we were to be blessed with a child. Our son came in December as we prepared for Christmas, and the people, they rejoiced with us. But at night we lay together, our babe between us, and we waited. But he did not come. I know now what I knew not then, which is that when the land is frozen hard with snow and frost, the dwarves are trapped in their kingdoms beneath the earth. But spring always comes. The snows, they melted, the flowers began to bloom, and the earth grew soft. And there was a night. We sat before the fire, our baby in his cradle, and he appeared. He stepped from the shadows. It was the first time I had seen him for myself. He was not as high as my waist, his face craggy and worn like stone or wood aged with time. His beard was long and white, tucked up into his belt, and he smiled. It was an ancient, soft smile, but in that smile, my wife and I knew terror. I reached for my dagger, for I wore no sword that night, and he snapped. The air grew sharp and brittle. A spark ran along his beard, and it felt as if bands of iron wrapped themselves around me. I could not breathe. I could barely move, gasping for breath. He drew close, staring down into that cradle on which he had to stand tiptoe. And my wife, she ran, scooping up our boy. He is mine. By promise and wager, he is mine. I could make you give him to me, but it would be sweeter if he was given willingly. I watched her arms tighten around our boy. Another bargain, then. You would bargain again? Tell me what I must do to keep my child. Guess my name. What? Guess my name. I will return tomorrow night, and the 2 nights after, if you can guess my name. Have as many tries as you like. He is yours. But if not, he comes with your good will. I watched her nod ever so slightly. Who I spoke to and what I traded to learn the dwarf's dwelling place, I cannot say. But I could not stand another night, bound by magic, listening to name after name after name, hearing the desperation rise in her voice until there were no more names to speak. I rode up into the hills, into the woods where the trees grow ancient and thick, so close at last I had to lead my horse there among those great trunks. And I found it. I found the clearing where I had been told it would be, ancient trees standing sentinel, that oh so full moon shining down. A fire burned there, and across from it on an old stump sat the dwarf, that great cascade of his beard glowing white in the moonlight, for he sat brushing it out and braiding it up. His eyes met mine as I stepped into the clearing. They were old and fathomless. He held up his fingers, but I opened my hands. No tricks. I just wish to speak. Very well. Sit down. I seated myself across the fire from him. Please. Why do you want him? Is he some meal to you? Son of Adam, you are not the only one who wants a child. Why, I would raise him as my own, make him a prince in the kingdoms beneath the earth. It has been many long years since I have tasted the flesh of men, and if I wanted it, it would be far easier to obtain than a child I fairly won, freely bargained, freely lost. You like to wager. I watched the grin split his cheeks. His teeth, old and yellow, glowed in the firelight. I do. But what have you to wager against what you have already lost? He watched my face fall. You have nothing. Nothing worth the wager to one such as I. You're cold? I made for you your kingdom. But, perchance you will be blessed with a second child. 2 to rear up would be sweeter than 1. Or if not, would you wager your own self? It would be a fine thing indeed to have a king as a servant, to be seen among my people riding on the shoulders of a king. Or if not, maybe I would transform you into a bear to guard my treasure, to make you dance. I opened my hand. The moonlight and the fire together fell on the old bone dice there, worn and smooth. Double or nothing? Come closer. I arose and made my way around the fire. I seated myself before him. He brushed back that braid of his beard. He smoothed out the ground between us with those fingers long like gnarled twigs. You would wager all on a single throw? No magic. Where would be the fun in that? No. Odds or evens? Odds. Always odds. I felt the firelight warm on my neck, the dice smooth in my hand. The moonlight painted him. He sat there crouched in anticipation. I watched him run his tongue along his lips. Once, twice, 3 times they bounced between us, a 1 and a 6, 7 odds. Before I could even think, I was on my feet, my sword was in my hand, and I cut. He leapt back. We stared each other down across that stump upon which lay his beard cut through. He snapped, but the air, it did not change. No iron fell upon my limbs, no spark ran along his magic was in his beard. I met his eyes. They filled with rage and hatred and impotence, feelings I knew all too well. I held my sword between us. It felt strange in my hand. I did not want to kill him, but his face, the granite of his cheeks turned into a landslide. You are a cheat and a coward and a bad loser. When my beard grows long again, I will come for what I am owed. Your wife's wager and your own. Double or nothing the wager was, and I have nothing but time. He turned and ran into the forest, the darkness, and the night. It was long past dawn by the time I returned to the castle. I saw her there, standing in the courtyard, our boy in her arms. She watched as I reined up my horse, as I dismounted, as I handed the horse to our stable boy, and finally I met her eyes, so full of fear, of hope, of... I know not what she saw in my own, but there, in the dust of my courtyard, I went down upon my knee before the woman that I loved, my wife, the mother of my child. And I laid before her the long braid of the dwarf's beard. It is done. He will not visit us tonight. "18 years have passed since that day, and the country, it has flourished. The golden thread, it let us prosper. And my boys, for it was not a year later, we were blessed with a second son. I watch them as they ride out, hawking and hunting as king's sons should. And I see the joy in my wife's face every time she looks at them. But I have begun to watch the shadows, for I have seen him there, out of the corners of my eyes, watching them, watching us. How long does it take for a dwarf's beard to grow long again? I do not know. Thank you.
Ooh.
Oh.
Oh my God.
Thank you, friends.
That's his one.
Super.
Bravo.
Thank you all.
Wonderful.
Oh,
Wonderful.
Diving.
thank you.
Oh.
Oh, all right. Let me find Anne here. Let me bring her back. There we go. There is Anne. I'm going to mute all once more. So, Anne, you'll have to unmute yourself. Oh, nope. Don't unmute, please, friends. Sorry. We'll get this. All right. There we go. There we go. One more time. You have to unmute yourself. There we go. I'll figure this out eventually.
We good?
You're good.
Okay. In a widow's cottage in the woods, there grew 2 rose bushes, one twined round the other, and one of them bloomed white and the other bloomed red. In that cottage lived the widow and her 2 daughters, one called Snow White and the other Rose Red. These 2 sisters loved their mother and each other, but they were as different as sisters often can be. Rose Red, her place was the forest, finding where the foxes hid their kits, discovering where the mushrooms were sprouting in the dark and the down. Snow White, oh, her heart lay on the hearth. She would shine the kettle until it shone as if it was gold. She would sweep and she would bake, and the house was filled with either smell or song. One winter, the widow sat reading to her daughters as they sat to their spinning. Rose Red would card the wool, pulling those fibers straight, picking out the burrs and bits of grass, handing great armfuls of the fluffy white wool to her sister Snow White, who would spin it into long thread. The wind howled and the snow whipped at their house, and the fire was cheerier for the cold outside. And as they sat, there was a knock at the door. Their mother looked at them. Rose Red, go to the door and see who is there. It is likely some traveler who's been lost, and we must offer them the comfort of our fire. Rose Red went to the door. She opened it, but instead of a traveler, a huge bear stuck his head into the cottage. Rose Red stepped back, a scream on her lips, Snow White already shrieking, and their mother beginning to rise from her chair when the bear spoke. Do not be afraid. I mean you no harm. It is so cold out here. I saw your fire. May I curl up beside it tonight? The widow slowly lowered herself back in her chair, for whether it was a bear speaking or the kind words that he said, she nodded. And Rose Red pulled the door open wide enough so he could push his way into that little cottage. Snow White pulled aside the spinning and the wool, and the bear settled in front of the fire with a sizzle and a sigh. There was a crust of white snow over his black coat. And Rose Red closed the door and looked at him. And Snow White looked at him, but she saw the snow beginning to drip on her carpet. She went over and she took her broom and she began to gently brush the bear off. And the bear shook a bit. And so she sang, "Black is the color of my true love's hair. His face is soft and wondrous fair. the purest eye and the strongest hand. I love the ground whereon he stands. And the bear, now clean from the snow, settled even deeper into the warmth. The two girls sat again to their spinning, and as their mother began to look for the place she had left off in her book, the bear rolled over onto his side to let another part of him warm by the fire and watched as the girls spun, and all he said was, "Fortunes can be won and lost on a spinning wheel." When the evening was done and it was time to douse the lamps, their mother turned to the bear. "You should stay the night. It is cold outside and it won't get any warmer. So you should stay by our fire." The girls that night fell asleep to the rumbling sighs of the bear's snoring. The next morning, Snow White rose to start the fire and prepare their morning meal, and the bear was already awake. His face pointed towards the door, smelling the morning air that was coming through the cracks. She opened the door and said, "You should come back tonight. It is not going to be any warmer tonight. Come back, join us by our fire." And the bear nodded and lumbered out into the cold. And as he walked past, she let her hand brush along his thick black fur. And so began a strange winter. The bear every night would come to their door, and Rose Red would wait to hear his shuffled knocking and open it to let him in, Snow White sweeping the snow from his coat. But there was one day when the snow melted as the same day it fell, and when the bear stood with his head towards the door that morning, Snow White opening it, he looked at her. "I'll come again no more." "Well, why not? It still is cold at night. You shouldn't be out there in the cold." "It is getting warm enough." "I have to protect the gold. The dwarves will come again above ground, and I have to protect the treasure." And with that, he lumbered out into the cool spring air. Snow White told her sister and mother of the bear and that he would no longer be returning. And though they were sad to see their guest go, spring has its tasks, and they were soon busy with the lambing and the planting and preparing for the coming seasons. And come the seasons did. The rose bush began to push out those green leaves. They could see the tiny formation of the buds when one day Rose Red came into the cottage, a wild look in her eyes. "Snow White, we have to go into the woods. We have been doing tasks around the house forever, and the woods are calling. Let's go see where the robins have put their nests, and we can gather firewood while we're at it. It will be a good task, and we can go into the forest. Please come." Snow White could never resist her sister when she was in that mood, and so she put her broom aside, and together they walked in the forest. They started to spy where the robins would put their nests. They started to look for the signs that the does were looking for a place to have their babies. And they were picking up wood, as they might, when they came to a large fallen tree. And they saw something moving on the far end, and as they came around, they saw a curious sight. A little man in a brown coat and a red cap with a long white beard. Well, his beard had somehow gotten stuck in the tree, and he was jumping around like a dog at the end of a leash, swearing and cursing and trying to get his beard free. And the girls watched him for a moment, but finally Snow White said, "Do you need some help with that?" The dwarf turned, his eyes hard as stone, looking at the two girls. "Of course I need help. Help me, you ninnies." Despite his rude words, the girls set down their wood and they sat to help him. They began to pull and tug at his beard. He was pulling and tugging, and Rose Red looked, "How did this happen?" "I was cutting wood, if you must know. I drove my wedge into the tree and it slipped out, thus catching my beard, leaving me helpless, and you two to come along." Rose Red said, "Well, I'm not sure we can do this by ourselves. We might need to get some help." "Get some help? You two are more than enough help and hindrance as it is. Do something." Snow White at these words thought for just a moment, I know what to do. She slipped her hand into her pocket. She pulled out her sewing scissors, and before the dwarf could say anything, she snipped off the end of his beard. Now the dwarf had been pulled at tension, so when that bit of beard was snipped away, he fell backwards, rolling head over heels. When he stood, the girls stood, he looking up at them. You stupid cows. He snapped his fingers, and a little bit flickering lightning rolled down his beard. But he did not seem to be happy with that. He stepped menacingly towards them, and Rose Red stepped back, her foot hitting a bag that had been hidden in the roots. It jingled of coin. The dwarf, seeing that she had seen the bag, jumped forward, grabbed the bag, and then, cursing, walked into the forest. Girls watched him go. Ungrateful wretch, said Snow White. I wonder if that's the dwarf the bear was talking about. Said Snow White. Dwarves and talking bears. Soon we'll have dragons in these woods. Mark my words. And they went home and they told their mother of the story, who found it was interesting, but then they had other things to think about, for spring was rolling into summer, and summer has its own tasks. And they planted the garden, and they milked the goats, and those rose bushes began to bud until you could see at the very tip of those rose buds, the white and the red. And then came a day, it was warm and the tasks had been done, and their mother said, Snow White, Rose Red, go down to the river, cool your feet, and catch us some fish for dinner. And the girls didn't need to be told twice. Off they went down to the river, talking and going over and under tree, until there it was, that shining river winding through their woods. There at the bank, they saw something jumping and hopping. From how far away they were thinking maybe it was a grasshopper, but as they got closer, they saw it was their friend, well, acquaintance, the dwarf. He had somehow managed to hook a huge fish and at the same time get his beard tangled in his line. Now the fish was almost as big as he was, and so there was a tug of war happening, with the fish wanting to make his way downstream and the dwarf trying to keep himself on the bank. The girls watched this for a moment until Rose called out, are you going to go in there after it? And the dwarf didn't even look behind, but said, help me, you ninnies! And they came down, one grabbing the line and the other trying to untangle his beard. Snow White had deft and fine fingers, which could very often pull out any knot, but this was one she could not manage. And so as Rose Red pulled the fish towards the bank and up onto the shore, Snow White took the scissors from her pocket and for the second time snipped off a piece of that dwarf's beard. The girls, the dwarf, the fish fell into the mud, and the girls, looking at the mud, began to laugh, but the dwarf stood. How dare you? How could you? He snapped, and but a small trickle of lightning began to form, and he began to shake. But then he reached into the mud, and he picked up what seemed to be weeds, and he gave them a swish in the water, and there in his hands were strings of pearls. And he, screaming and cursing over his shoulder, began to stalk down the river's edge. Rose Red watched him go. Ungrateful wretch. Well, we have a fish, though, waste not, want not. And the girls stood and began to wring the water out of their petticoats when Rose Red touched Snow White's arm. Snow, look. Across the river, there was a bear. A big, black bear. And Snow, her face lit up with joy. Oh, she stepped towards him, but Rose said, wait, we don't know if he's our bear. And so Snow White began to sing. Black is the color of my true love's hair. His face is soft and wondrous fair. The purest eye and the strongest hand. I love the ground whereon he stands. The bear's ears were turned towards them, listening to the song, his head turned to the side. But then a particularly loud shriek and curse from the dwarf echoed up the river, and the bear swung his head that way. His lip pulling up into a snarl. And he began to stalk down the river after that sound. The girls took their fish and the tail home to their mother. And so the summer wore on, and the roses began to bloom. They bloomed, and the smell surrounded the cottage. Snow White brought in flowers every day to fill the cottage with that smell as well. And so it was. One afternoon, the mother called her girls to them. Girls, go down into town, get some needle and some thread and some ribbon. It's time to do our mending. Take care and come back before the sun sets. And off the girls went. There they went out of the woods, along the moor, following the path down into town. But as they looked out across that beautiful rolling hill, they saw a hawk, an eagle. It was a huge bird. It was circling, and then it dove. It dove for prey, and the girls watched it, and then it picked something up, and it began to fly away, and that something was kicking and struggling and cursing. And the girls ran to help. They grabbed the dwarf, who was now the prey of this eagle. They began to pull back and forth until the eagle let go with a shriek of frustration and flew away, and the dwarf tumbled down to safety. His gratitude was very quickly apparent when he stood up and he inspected his clothes, and he said, "You stupid girls! You do cut my beard, and now you ruin my clothes. I will never be able to show my face among my kind again." And he picked up a bag that had been on the ground near them, and it rattled as if there were stones inside, and he stalked off into the stones that were dotting the hillside. Rosewood watched him go. Ungrateful wretch. And then they went down to town. Down to town they went, and they bought their needle and their thread and their ribbon, and they were making their way home. The sun was getting quite low in the sky, and they were eager to make their way, so they took a path through the rocks near the river. And as they came around a particularly large boulder, they stopped. There on the ground was more color than they had seen all together in one place. It was more color than they would see in the flowers, for there were jewels on the ground. Rubies as red as the sunset. The emeralds so green they blended into the grass. The diamonds white as fresh fallen snow. And the girls could hardly breathe, for it was so beautiful. And there, hunched above those gems, was the dwarf. He turned and saw them. His face went from red to purple. This is what it has been all along. You came to steal my treasure. You cut my beard to shorten my magic. Daughter of Eve or son of Adam, you are all the same. You all wish to take what is mine. And he picked up a sharp rock on the ground and began to walk towards the girls. And the girls began to step back when a growl came from the woods. And following that growl came a huge black bear. That bear loping forward until it was close enough to rise and tower above the dwarf, who went from purple to white and began to cry, "No, no, take them. They're fat. You can eat them and you'll be taken care of all winter long. Let me live." But the bear did not listen to the pleas of the dwarf, only striking him once across the head. The dwarf went end over end, hit a rock, fell into the river, and was washed out of this story. Now, the girls did not take time to figure out what was going to happen next. They picked up their skirts and they began to run. And as they ran, they heard a song behind them. Black is the color of my true love's hair. Her face is soft and wondrous fair. The purest eye and the strongest hand. I love the ground whereon she stands. The girls turned and looked, and the bear was walking towards them on all fours, and then on two, and then he began to shake and twist as his skin split open, and he shook off the bear pelt. And there standing before them was a young man, black hair, a large beard, and a suit of gold. And the girls were not sure whether to run. And so the man spoke, "Let me explain. My father made a wager. He made a wager for me and my brother's lives, and he lost. My brother and I have been cursed to be bears for many long winter, and the bear continues, and the dwarf continued to steal our treasures. And so my brother and I were forced to hunt him. But we could never find him because of his magic. And you, Snow White, by your kindness, shortened his magic, allowing us to find him and for me to kill him." Things somewhat explained, the girls invited the man to come home with them. And their mother was quite surprised and happy to have the bear-turned man now in her home, and she admired the fine golden thread that made his suit, and she insisted she give him a haircut. And when he had a fine haircut, he went to the edge of the forest and called out, and out of the forest came his brother, who also had the black beard and the wild hair, but his eyes were more wild, for he had not spent a winter in the comfort of other humans. And as these stories go, the girls married the princes. Snow White married the one who had stayed with them all winter. And Rose Red, after some mutual taming, married the brother who had stayed in the forest. And as these stories sometimes do not go, Snow White moved into the castle, and Rose Red and her husband stayed in the forest, which suited their natures. But Snow White, she took a clipping of the rose bushes. She planted it on either side of her gate, and those rose bushes climbed up and twined one round the other. And whether it was castle or cottage, those roses bloomed red and white, summer after summer after summer.
Wonderful.
Oh, beautiful,
Wonderful.
beautiful. Fantastic.
Lovely.
Oh,
Nice match of stories there.
Yeah. Lovely.
oh, thank you so much, Anne. That's the first time we have done those now as a piece together. That was really,
Well done.
really lovely. All right. Once more, I shall mute all. Great. All right, so we have one more story for you today. And after this, we hope you all have a lovely summer solstice, this longest day of the year, that it brings you joy. And so this story, as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to tell this week, for some of you as well, it has been an incredibly hot week here in Colorado. We've been about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And so my mind has gone to this story, which is a story of the desert. I first heard this story from storyteller Laura Sims. She got it from this book, The Black Prince and Other Egyptian Folktales by Ahmed and Zain Zaghloul. This is the farthest back that I can trace this book, or trace the story. I have some Egyptian storyteller friends who that's the farthest back they know it as well. So if it is literary, I beg your apologies. But the Ahmed and Zain Zaghloul claim it as a folktale, so we shall take them at their word. I've done a fair amount of changing to this story, so if you know Laura's, you may hear a glimmer of her words in my own, and for that I owe her a debt. So let me make sure we're all good here, and then we shall continue. Once, long ago, when Pharaoh ruled over Egypt, in the capital city lived a girl who was ugly, stupid, lazy, and poor. Her mother was a washerwoman. They lived together in a little mud-walled hut at the edge of the river, and during the days at the well, her mother was like to speak of her daughter with the other women. You know she is so strange. Her face is flat. Her shoulders are hunched, but her eyes are like the moon over the river Nile. And you know she goes about each day, her hair undone, wild, that simple dress. She wears no shoes. You cannot force her feet into sandals. And all day long she does no work. She wanders about the city, but she knows everyone, whether they are nobles or merchants or peasants or beggars. And she rarely speaks. She says that she listens to what people mean or what they feel, and when it touches her heart, she takes out that flute. You know she carved it from the leg bone of an ox. And she plays what she feels. And while her mother often disparaged her daughter, what she feared most was that the girl, in the way that she would want to do, was like to lay down by the river to sleep and would be eaten by the crocodiles. Now her mother's words were true. The girl did no work. Each day she wandered the streets of the city, and she did know many people, and they knew her. And there came a day as she wandered through a quarter she was unaccustomed to, and there she saw a high white wall, and from beyond that wall, a smell of flowers, the like of which she had never before smelled. Her arms were strong. She climbed the wall, and she crouched there in the shadow of a tree and looked down on the most beautiful garden she had ever seen. There were tall trees there. She had never seen the like before, flowers of every hue and fragrance, and there in the center of the garden, a still, clear pool of water in which was reflected the most beautiful man she had ever seen. He sat staring into the waters. He did not stir at her approach, and she waited. She waited until the wind blew towards her, and she lifted the flute, and she began to play. She played the wind in the trees. She played the fragrance of those flowers. She played the still water of the pool and his beauty therein. All that day she played, until as night came on, a servant came from the house, called the young man inside. She climbed down from the wall. Her head was a whirl. Her heart was abuzz. That night she would not eat. She could barely sleep. She tossed and turned, thinking perhaps it was a dream brought on by fever or too much heat. That next morning she awoke, half dreading, half hoping the garden would not be there. She made her way slowly through the streets of the city, but there it was, that white wall, the fragrance of the flowers. She climbed the wall, there again sat in the shadow, and there he was. He sat as if he had not moved. And all that day she played her flute, the day following and the day after. And at night she tossed and turned. She barely slept. In what bits she could, she caught a bit of dream that perhaps she would find the courage in herself to call down to him, that he would look up to her, that he would feel the love for her that she felt for him, that he would come up out of the garden with her and come to her mother's hut to live as man and wife. But there was a day when she climbed that white wall, and he was not there. She waited hour after hour after hour until the sun hung low in the sky, and he did not come. At last she climbed down from the wall. She went to where her mother was with the other women at the well. She sat and she listened to their gossip and their words, and in their words she heard of a white wall she recognized, of the fragrance of flowers no one knew, and a name: Rahotep, the prince Rahotep, the pharaoh's youngest son Rahotep. And at that word she felt her heart begin to split, feel it crack, feel it shatter into 1,000 pieces she could not catch, for she knew that a man with the blood of the gods in his veins could not love a girl who was ugly, stupid, lazy, and poor. She rose from the well, her head abuzz. She began to walk through the streets of the city until she saw them, those great gates in that high brown wall. And beyond it, just beyond the gates, a merchant caravan bedded down, preparing to set out the next day. And many of the merchants, they recognized the girl with the flute. They called to her, bid her sit with them. One pressed into her hands a cup of tea. And she sat. and she listened to them as they told the kind of stories that merchants tell, of far off lands, of adventure, of treasure, of magic. Their stories of magic chiefly concerned a wizard named Habi. You know he has a carpet that he has but to roll out and climb upon, grasp it by the front tassels, and he can fly as far as China before the sun it sets. That is true, but moreover his turban, he has but to unwind it and lay it upon the river. Step upon it, and it shall form for him a boat upon which he can sail all the 7 seas. Aye, it is true, but it is not merely his treasure for which he is renowned, his wisdom. Why? He is so wise that the king of the Jinn, when he has a question he cannot answer, he will come to the old man. He will prostrate himself before Habi. He will beg him. He will offer any gift for but a morsel of the old man's wisdom. On and on their stories went until at last the girl turned towards the man beside her. Is it true? Is he real? Oh yes, why there is a place he lives not far from here. If you were to walk 3 days and 3 nights towards the rising sun, you would come to an oasis. And if there is a donkey tied to the door of the hut you would find Habi. And is it true that he can shape a man or woman's soul? Aye. Anything under heaven is his to command, if he so wish it. She sat that night, and when the eastern sky just began to lighten, she rose. She traded what few small coins she had for a bag of food and a skin of water. With these on her shoulders, she began to walk towards the sun as it lit her face. Out and out into the desert she walked as the sun rose high, as it began to burn her skin, as her lips they blistered until each speck of sand became a pinprick of fire beneath her feet. She walked as the sun set and the moon rose, and the cold sank down into her bones until she shivered with every step. On and on and on she walked for 3 days and 3 nights, until as the sun rose on the morning of the 4th day, at the top of that dune, she looked down and she saw green and water running down among the trees. There was a little hut and a donkey tied to the door. She pounded on the door, collapsing as it opened before the little wizened man. Girl, you are burned with the sun. Come in, please. Are you him? Are you Habi, the miracle worker, the sorcerer, the wizard? Are you him? I have been called all those things. Come in out of the sun, girl. He lifted her and brought her in. He laid her down. He brought her water. And when she had drunk, she clasped him by the hand. Please, tell me, is it true? Can you shape a man or woman's soul? I can do that thing. Please, I beg you, make me what I am not. Make me tall, make my hair long and flowing, make me a queen, make me haughty and arrogant in battle, worthy in court, make me what I am not. Girl, you must know that when I shape a man or woman's soul, it cannot be worked back again. What's done is done. Please, I beg you. And how shall you pay me for my magic? For there must always be a price. She looked down. She had nothing save the flute. Aye, that will do well. Play your flute, and I will work my magic. She took it to her mouth, and she began to play. She played 3 days and 3 nights in the desert, the burning heat and the freezing cold. She played the high brown wall of the city, the dust swirling in its streets, the merchants haggling in the bazaar, the women gossiping at the well, the processions of nobles. She played the white wall of the prince's garden. She played the wind in the leaves of the trees. She played the fragrance of the flowers and the still water of the pool, and in it reflected his beauty. She played on and on and on, and the time passed. In that time, the king of Libya raised his armies and invaded Egypt. The Pharaoh called his soldiers and his nobles to his banners, and he met the Libyans, but they were cast back into the desert sands. Again and again and again, the Pharaoh's armies were cast back until his nobles began to slip away in the night, until his soldiers began to desert his cause, until at last he sat camped with a ragged remnant there in the desert. And for the first time in his life, the Pharaoh contemplated surrender, defeat. As he did, his sentries began to call to one another, pointing out into the desert as if from the setting sun itself they saw a great war chariot come. 4 great black horses rode before that chariot, and standing tall in it was a woman, her skin like polished ebony, her hair like a flood of onyx flying out behind her. In her hand she bore a great black bow, and at her side a silver khopesh, the curved swords of Egypt. As she drew close, the soldiers found that none could meet her eyes, for they burned as if filled with 1,000 falling stars. Through the Pharaoh's camp she rode until she reined up those horses before his tent. Down she stepped. The soldiers guarding the Pharaoh's tent felt they could do nothing but pull back the flaps, so awesome was her presence. In she walked. She stood tall, unbent, unbowed. Are you some goddess? Skemet, perhaps, come to deliver us in our hour of need? No. No blood of the gods runs in my veins. But if you give command of your armies to me, Pharaoh, I will deliver Egypt. There was nothing for him to do but nod. And that next morning, standing atop her chariot, she spoke words of fire that kindled the hearts of the soldiers. And together, they laid a trap, there deep in the desert sands, into which they drew the Libyan cavalry, and when they were done, it was broken horses and dying men that stained the sands red. And the news went round, and the Pharaoh's soldiers and his nobles began to rally back to his banners, and when they met the Libyans, it was the Libyans that were cast back time and time again. Always she was there, the woman they began to call the Black Queen, that great war chariot scything its way through the Libyan army, her bow spelling death for any man upon whom she might lay her eyes, and her silver khopesh leaving bloody silver ruin behind her. The nobles and princes of Egypt began to fight amongst themselves, jockeying who might be her charioteer. A slave's job, but so awesome was the glory to stand in her presence. Back and back and back they drove the Libyans, deep into their own country and into Morocco beyond, and when the war was done, the Black Queen seated herself upon the throne of Libya, and she smiled. It was the Pharaoh who came to her. And there, beneath an awning in her garden, they sipped rosewater sherbet from silver cups. Please, my friend, if I may call you that, give me time, give me a month, and I shall make my capital beautiful for you. Come in triumph with the army, and on that day I shall offer you anything you wish to name. Land, power, wealth, half my kingdom if you wish it is yours. And the Black Queen, she smiled. The streets of the city were swept clean, the walls painted new white, and there came a day as the gates opened. That great war chariot leading the procession of the army through the streets. Rose petals fell from the windows. Men cheered to see her return. She reined up the chariot before the Pharaoh's palace. In she went to the cheers of his court, and she stood unbent, unbowed. And again he made his offer of land, of wealth, of power. Anything she asked would be hers. Pharaoh, I have won land and wealth and power enough in my conquest of Egypt. What I need is a man to sit beside me upon the throne, to rule in wisdom and power. And so I ask only this. Give me the hand in marriage of your son Rohotep. The whisper ran around the room. Rahotep, Rahotep, the pharaoh's youngest son. It was almost an insult. But before the pharaoh could speak, the prince himself stepped forward. Father, please, your majesty, I beg you. Before you speak, before you seal my fate, hear what I have to say. The Black Queen held up her hand. Tell me, your majesty, this is a gift unlooked for. I would sit beside you, give you what little wisdom I have. I love you as every man or woman in this room loves you, for you are the savior of our country. But before you ask again, I must tell you this. I cannot love you as a man so loves a woman. The courtiers began to buzz like angry wasps, but the Black Queen held up her hand again and the silence fell. Tell me your story. Your Majesty, before the war, I was an arrogant and haughty young man. Nothing in this world was good enough for me. Any food lacked some savor. Any woman brought before me, there was always some flaw in any piece of music, always a jangling note. It was only in nature that I found beauty. And so I had planted in the city here a garden with a white wall. And in that garden are trees from every land on earth. There are flowers that I am certain only bloom therein. There is a still pool of water, and when I sit there, when I hear the rustle of the leaves, when I smell the fragrance of those flowers, when I see the still waters of that pool, it is only there I have found peace. Until a day. There was a day before the war, a girl climbed the wall of my garden. She sat in the shade of a tree. She did not see me sitting there before the pool. She was unlike anyone I have ever seen before. Her face was flat, her shoulders hunched, but her eyes were like moonlight on still water. And then she took from her side a white flute and she began to play. And it was if the music was the very wind in the trees or the fragrance of the flowers, the very water of the pool. There was no misnote, there was only beauty in that music. I sat still all that day, lest I startle her, until, as night came, a servant came from the house to call me in. That night I could not sleep. I tossed and turned, thinking perhaps it was a dream or a mirage brought on by fever or the heat. And the next day I rose with dawn. I sat and I waited. And then she came. Again she sat on the wall and she played the flute. Day after day. I barely ate. I could not sleep. I began to daydream that maybe I would have the courage to raise my eyes to her, to call to her that she might come down off the wall into my palace to be my wife. And then there was a day. I was called away on my father's business. And when I returned the day after, she did not return. Nor the day after, nor the day after. Finally, I sent my servants out into the city. Perhaps someone had heard of the girl with the flute, someone who knew of her. And there were merchants, there were nobles, there were beggars that knew of the girl with the flute. At last we were directed to her mother's hut, a washerwoman that lives on the banks of the river. And there, her mother told me that she feared that her daughter, as she was like to do, had laid down by the river to sleep and been devoured by the crocodiles. And hearing those words, I felt my heart tear itself in two, that it should never be knit up again. With treasure, I saw her given a funeral worthy of a princess. I saw her mother given treasure that she might never work another day again. But I tell you, your majesty, that I would reign beside you, give you what little wisdom I have, but I cannot love you. At his words, the court erupted in clamor. The pharaoh called for silence, but it would not come, and in the noise and chaos, the Black Queen stepped close to the prince. Oh, Rahotep, oh, Rahotep. I too know a love the like of which you speak, and I would never ask you to betray that love. She took his chin in her hand, she bent her head and kissed him upon the brow. Then she turned and she walked from the palace. And when the Pharaoh had restored order, he sent his servants out to seek her out. They found that great war chariot there, the horses stamping impatiently, but in the market they found an old man holding that great black bow in his hands, the death of so many of Egypt's enemies, for which she had given him in exchange for only a bag of food. And a beggar woman, that great silver khopesh gleaming in the dying sun, for which she had traded only a skin of water. And the guards at the gates, they knelt before the Pharaoh. They stammered out how they had last seen the Black Queen walking into the desert, following her shadow cast by the setting sun. And if she found her flute, I cannot tell you. But the Black Queen was never seen again. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Oh, thank you, friends.
Very nice.
Mm,
Bravo.
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 really wonderful.
Thank
Nice
you
work.
all so much. All right, I'm going to bring Anne and I back for just a moment. Thank you all so much for coming. This has been really lovely. We haven't done a daytime show in a while, so thank you all. Thank you all so much. We have a couple of things upcoming. The biggest of which is our next Fairy Tale Variations. If you don't know about these shows, we take one story and we get a bunch of people, usually 5, to each tell a variant of the story. We've done Snow White and Rapunzel, and we have not done Rapunzel. We've done Rumpelstiltskin. You heard
On the list.
other R's. And this next one is a little bit a gift to myself from me. We are doing King Arthur. We are not doing any one specific Arthur story, but each tale is a variant or a play on Arthur. Jennifer Monroe is doing her amazing Fisher King. Megan Wells is doing a stunning blending of the creation of the Round Table and the Dame Ragnell stories. It should be a really glorious time. That is July 11th. Everybody, so you're aware, all of these, everything we talk about, there will be an email going out in 4 minutes that will have all of the links to all of these things. And you should talk about Story Podcast.
Actually, I've got a couple podcasts to tell you about. I've got Story Podcast, which is the podcast I've been doing for the last 4 years now, and featured some of the storytellers that are here today. And it's a wonderful, wonderful podcast all about traditional folk and fairy tale, and is quite and it's on all of your podcast spaces. I've also started a new podcast because that's what you do when a pandemic happens. I have taken the book Jane Eyre and I've created it in a steampunk world. I have a really lovely friend, Anita Feldman, who has a English accent and can pronounce French words and phrases, which I cannot do. And she's doing the narration for it, and it's being released chapter by chapter. And 4 chapters are out. You'll find it under Public Works Steampunk Presents Jane Eyre. So that's another one that just launched this last week.
And being as it's so new, it's not in my brain. That will not be in the email going out in now 3 minutes, but you will all receive an email probably tomorrow with a link to the recording of this show. So if you had to step away, if you had to walk away, if you'd like to watch it again, you will all receive that link. And in that email, we will make sure to include the link to Anne's new podcast. So we'll make sure that that's in there. Again, thank you all so much for coming. We usually stick around and chat with folks a little bit if you'd like to hang out and chat with us. But thank you all so much for coming. And for those of you that are in the US or these time zones, have a lovely rest of the day. And for our European friends that were able to join us, thank you so much for spending your night with us.
And have good dreams.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
It was wonderful.
Oh.
I've been ever since Cooper crafted his Rumpelstiltskin. I've been wanting to do the two of those stories together, because that's how we solved some of the Rumpelstiltskin issues.